900 years ago, most people never left their village. Life was short, violent, and painfully uncertain. People feared not just death, but dying without meaning. Then a single promise appeared. Walk east, suffer, kill, and your soul would be saved. This is how the Crusades began. Before we speak about battles, blood, or holy cities, we need to understand one simple truth about the medieval world. People did not think like we do. For a modern person, religion is often private, something internal, optional, sometimes symbolic. For a medieval person, faith was the structure of reality itself. It explained why the sun rose, why crops failed, why children died, and why kings ruled. In the 11th century, Europe was not a collection of strong nations. It was a fragmented land of forests, villages, castles, and dirt roads. Most people never traveled more than 30 kilometers from where they were born. The world was small, dark, and dangerous. Life expectancy was low. Disease was everywhere. War between local lords was constant. And above all, life felt temporary. People genuinely believed that eternity mattered more than survival. A world obsessed with salvation. The medieval Christian lived with one dominant fear: damnation. Hell was not a metaphor. It was real. Heaven was not abstract. It was a destination. Every sin had weight. Every action echoed into eternity. Knights especially lived with this contradiction. They were trained to kill, yet killing endangered their souls. A knight could massacre enemies in battle, burn villages, and still kneel in church the next morning, terrified that God was watching everything. So the question haunted them: how can a man of violence be saved? The Crusades would offer an answer. Jerusalem, the center of the universe. In medieval Christian imagination, Jerusalem was not just a city. It was the center of the world, the place where Christ died, the place where salvation history unfolded. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was considered one of the greatest acts of devotion. But by the late 11th century, Jerusalem was under Muslim control, ruled by the Seljuk Turks. Christian pilgrims were still allowed, sometimes, but the journey was dangerous, expensive, and humiliating. Stories returned to Europe of pilgrims being robbed, of churches destroyed, of Christians taxed, beaten, or killed. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Some were propaganda. Some were true. But all of them ignited emotion: fear, anger, and opportunity. The Eastern Empire calls for help. Far to the east stood the Byzantine Empire, Christian, Greek-speaking, sophisticated, and ancient. By 1095, it was collapsing under pressure from Muslim expansion. Its emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, sent a desperate message to the West: send us soldiers, mercenaries, anything. He expected trained knights, paid troops under imperial command. What he received instead would shock the entire world. The speech that changed history. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles, bishops, and knights. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians, the desecration of holy places, the duty of Christendom. And then he offered something revolutionary: complete forgiveness of sins. Not penance, not years of prayer, not suffering in silence, but salvation through war. God wills it. Deus vult. The crowd erupted. For the first time in history, violence was framed not as a necessary evil, but as a holy act. Why people said yes. This is where modern people often misunderstand the Crusades. They imagine greed, conquest, imperialism. But most Crusaders lost money. Many sold their land, mortgaged their future, and never returned. So why go? Because the crusade promised salvation without purgatory, honor instead of shame, meaning instead of suffering. For a peasant, it meant escape from hunger. For a knight, redemption. For a younger son, purpose. In a world where life was short and brutal, the crusade gave pain a narrative. Today, people search for meaning in careers, self-improvement, therapy, travel. In the 11th century, meaning was found in God or nowhere at all. The first wave, chaos, begins. What followed was not an organized army. It was chaos. Tens of thousands of people, peasants, women, children, untrained fighters, began marching east before any official army was ready. This movement, later called the People's Crusade, would become a disaster. But at the time, it felt like destiny unfolding. The roads filled with crosses sewn onto clothing. Church bells rang. Villages emptied. The Crusades had begun. And no one truly understood what they had unleashed. The road east was not a road in the modern sense. There were no maps that ordinary people could read, no reliable signs, no shared understanding of distance. When the first Crusaders left their homes, many of them had only the vaguest idea of where Jerusalem actually was. They knew it was east. They knew it was far. And they knew that God would somehow guide them. Entire groups moved like wandering villages. Carts creaking under the weight of children and grain sacks, livestock driven alongside people, priests chanting prayers in languages most listeners did not understand. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. Hunger became normal. Dirt became permanent. The romantic idea of a holy journey dissolved quickly into aching feet, sickness, and the constant fear of dying anonymously on the roadside, far from home, without burial, without confession. What is important to understand is that most of these people were not soldiers. They were farmers, artisans, widows, teenagers. Many had never held a weapon before. When they marched, they sang hymns instead of drilling. They carried relics instead of supplies. And they believed, deeply and sincerely, that miracles would happen because they were doing God's will. When food ran out, they expected God to provide. When enemies appeared, they expected angels. This mindset is almost impossible for a modern person to truly feel. Today, even very religious people usually expect logistics, planning, backup options. The medieval crusader expected divine intervention as a practical solution. Faith was not emotional support, it was strategy. As these enormous, disorganized crowds moved through Europe, problems appeared almost immediately. Local populations were terrified. Imagine a modern city suddenly flooded by tens of thousands of armed, starving strangers who spoke different dialects, followed no clear authority, and claimed moral superiority because God was on their side. Towns were looted, fields were stripped bare, arguments turned into violence, and very quickly that violence turned inward. One of the darkest and most uncomfortable truths of the early Crusades is that before many crusaders ever saw a Muslim, they killed Jews, entire communities along the Rhine. They convinced themselves that if they were going to fight God's enemies abroad, they should begin with those they considered enemies at home. This was not commanded by the Pope, but it was tolerated, excused, and later forgotten by many chroniclers. It shows how easily religious certainty can turn into moral blindness. By the time the first waves reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire, they were no longer pilgrims. They were a humanitarian disaster. The Eastern Romans, far more urban, educated, and administratively sophisticated than their Western counterparts, were horrified. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had asked for disciplined mercenaries. What arrived instead were masses of starving civilians led by charismatic preachers who answered to no one. The Byzantines rushed them across the Bosporus as fast as possible, not out of generosity, but out of fear. They wanted these people gone. Once in Anatolia, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain and hostile forces, the people's crusade collapsed almost instantly. Poorly armed, badly led, and strategically clueless, they were slaughtered by Seljuk forces. Few survived. Those who did returned broken, carrying stories not of glory, but of horror. Only after this catastrophe did the real Crusader armies arrive, the nightly hosts of nobles, banners, and sworn oaths. These men were very different from the earlier crowds. They were trained for war from childhood. They lived in a culture where honor mattered more than comfort, where death in battle could be preferable to shame. Yet even for them, the journey was a test beyond anything they had known. Knights brought armor that weighed as much as a modern person's backpacking load, wore wool in scorching heat, and slept exposed to rain and insects. Horses died in huge numbers, and without a horse, a knight was no longer a knight. He was just a man with expensive metal on his body. Disease killed more crusaders than combat. Dysentery, dehydration, infected wounds, slow, humiliating deaths that no epic song would ever remember. Daily life on campaign was monotonous and exhausting. March, stop, pray, argue, march again. Food was a constant obsession. Bread, when available, was often moldy. Meat was rare and usually half-rotten. Water sources were fought over. And through all of this, priests reminded the Crusaders that suffering was not a problem. It was proof. Pain meant they were on the right path. Doubt, however, was dangerous. To question the crusade was to question God himself. In this way, the Crusades created a psychological trap. The worse things became, the more convinced many Crusaders were that they must continue. Turning back would mean that all the suffering had been meaningless, something the human mind desperately tries to avoid. If we compare this to the modern world, the contrast is striking. Today, when a project becomes painful, inefficient, or damaging, people are encouraged to reassess, to change course, to protect their mental and physical health. For the Crusader, quitting was not self-care, it was spiritual failure. Meaning was not something you optimized. It was something you endured. And so they kept moving east, step by step, carried forward by faith, fear, and the crushing momentum of a decision they could no longer escape. By the time these armies approached their first great objective, the city of Nicaea, they were already transformed. The romantic vision of a holy journey had been burned away by hunger, death, and betrayal. What remained was a hardened force capable of extreme brutality, and convinced, absolutely convinced, that God demanded it. When the Crusader armies finally reached Nicaea in 1097, the Siege of Nicaea was the first major battle of the First Crusade, taking place from May 14th to June 19th, 1097. The city was under the control of the Seljuk Turks, who opted to surrender to the Byzantines in fear of the Crusaders breaking into the city. They encountered something most of them had never truly faced before: a fortified city defended by a professional army. Medieval Europe had castles, but this was different. Nicaea had thick Roman walls, towers, a lake supplying the city with food and water, and experienced Seljuk defenders who understood siege warfare. The Crusaders, exhausted from the journey and already divided by rival leaders, suddenly realized that faith alone would not open gates. You could pray all day, but stone walls did not crack from belief. This moment is crucial because it marked the first time the crusade confronted reality head-on and adapted to it. Daily life during the siege was slow, repetitive, and psychologically draining. Crusaders woke with the sun, prayed, repaired equipment, scavenged for food, and stood watch. There were no heroic charges every day, mostly waiting. Waiting while hunger grew sharper. Waiting while disease spread through crowded camps. Waiting while men stared at the same walls and wondered how many months of their lives would be consumed by unmoving stone. Morale rose and fell unpredictably. One day a priest would claim a vision from God, and spirits would soar. The next day, a failed assault would leave dozens of bodies rotting in the heat, and silence would settle over the camp. This rhythm, hope, suffering, disappointment, became the emotional heartbeat of the Crusades. It was here that the crusade also began to change morally. Violence was no longer abstract or distant. It was intimate and sustained. Prisoners were taken, interrogated, sometimes killed, sometimes traded. Civilians inside the city were not invisible. They were starving faces on the walls, watching the besiegers with the same fear and hatred. Over time, empathy dulled. Killing stopped being shocking and started becoming procedural, a necessary task. When the city finally surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but secretly to the Byzantine emperor, many Crusaders felt betrayed. They had suffered, bled, and starved, and the reward had been taken from them through diplomacy. This sense of betrayal planted a dangerous idea. If political authority failed them, they would rely on force alone. As the army moved on, the road led deeper into hostile territory, toward Syria, and eventually toward Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Antioch was enormous, ancient, and almost impossibly well defended. Its walls stretched for kilometers over mountains and valleys. To besiege it was madness, yet turning back was unthinkable. By this point, many Crusaders had been gone from home for over 2 years. They had spent their wealth, lost friends and family, and crossed a psychological point of no return. Modern people often talk about sunk cost in business or relationships, the idea that we continue something because we've already invested too much to quit. Antioch was a medieval version of that trap, magnified by faith and fear of damnation. The siege of Antioch dragged on through winter, and winter was merciless. Food ran out completely. Horses were eaten. Leather belts were boiled and chewed. Men collapsed from weakness while standing guard. Desertion increased, and those caught trying to flee were sometimes punished publicly, not just as traitors but as sinners. Priests preached that suffering purified the soul, but empty stomachs do not listen well to theology. Morality continued to erode. Raiding nearby villages became routine. Civilians were killed without ceremony. The Crusaders began to see the surrounding land not as inhabited, but as resources to be consumed. Then, when Antioch finally fell through betrayal from within, celebration turned instantly into terror. A massive Muslim relief army arrived, and now the Crusaders found themselves trapped inside the very city they had just conquered. Starving, surrounded, hopeless, this was the lowest point of the entire First Crusade. It is here that the psychology of the Crusade fully transformed. Visions appeared again. Holy relics were discovered. Leaders claimed divine messages promising victory. Whether these were sincere beliefs or desperate fabrications hardly matters. The effect was real. Faith, once a motivation, now became a survival mechanism. To doubt was to collapse. To believe was to keep breathing. When the Crusaders finally broke out and defeated the relief army against all odds, something irreversible happened. They did not just believe God supported them, they believed God actively intervened on their behalf. From that moment on, success became proof of righteousness, and righteousness became justification for anything. Mercy became optional. Restraint became weakness. Violence became sacrament. The idea that would haunt the Middle East for centuries was now fully formed. If we win, God agrees with us. By the time the road turned south toward Jerusalem, the Crusaders were no longer pilgrims, no longer even just soldiers. They were a moving, hardened ideology, shaped by hunger, trauma, and absolute conviction. The city they sought was holy. What they had become on the way was something far more dangerous. By the summer of 1099, the Crusader armies stood before Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem marked the successful end of the First Crusade, whose objective was the recovery of the city of Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from Islamic control. The 5-week siege began on June 7, 1099, and was carried out by the Christian forces of Western Europe, mobilized by Pope Urban II after the Council of Clermont in 1095. The city had been out of Christian control since the Muslim conquest of the Levant in 637, and had been held for a century first by the Seljuk Turks and later by the Egyptian Fatimids. One of the root causes of the Crusades was the hindering of Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land, which began in the 4th century. A number of eyewitness accounts of the battle were recorded, including in the anonymous chronicle Gesta Francorum. After Jerusalem was captured on July 15, 1099, thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred by Crusader soldiers. As the Crusaders secured control over the Temple Mount, revered as the site of the 2 destroyed Jewish temples, they also seized Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and repurposed them as Christian shrines. Godfrey of Bouillon, prominent among the Crusader leadership, was elected as the first ruler of Jerusalem. The city that had existed in their imagination far longer than it had existed in their experience. For years, Jerusalem had been an idea rather than a place. Paintings in churches, sermons spoken from pulpits, prayers whispered before sleep. Many Crusaders believed that simply seeing the city would change them, cleanse them, complete something inside their souls. When they finally climbed the surrounding hills and saw its walls rising from the dry landscape, some wept openly. Others fell to their knees. The journey that had consumed their lives now had a physical endpoint. But the city itself did not greet them as a symbol. It greeted them as a fortress. The conditions surrounding Jerusalem were brutal. The region was dry, stripped of resources, and actively hostile. Water was scarce, and what little existed was often poisoned or guarded. The Crusaders, reduced in number by years of marching, disease, and desertion, were now expected to conduct a full-scale siege with inadequate equipment. There was no immediate miracle. No walls collapsed at prayer. No angels descended. Instead, there was heat, thirst, and desperation. Men drank from muddy pools shared with animals. Others collapsed and died simply from dehydration. Every day that passed weakened the army, and everyone knew it. Either Jerusalem would fall quickly, or the crusade would die outside its walls. Life in the camps before the assault was tense and strangely ritualistic. Crusaders fasted, confessed sins, and participated in barefoot processions around the city, believing they were reenacting biblical history, just as true Israelites once had. At the same time, they prepared ladders, siege towers, and weapons. Faith and violence were no longer separate spheres, they were fully fused. A man might pray for mercy in the morning and sharpen his sword in the afternoon. To the modern mind, this feels like contradiction. To the Crusader, it felt like alignment. God demanded purity of soul and brutality of action, and there was no tension between the two. When the assault finally came, it was sudden and overwhelming. Siege towers rolled forward under a hail of arrows and stones. Men climbed ladders knowing that the first several ranks would almost certainly die. Those behind stepped over bodies without stopping. The walls were taken piece by piece, hour by hour, until resistance finally collapsed. And then something happened that even many medieval chroniclers struggled to describe without discomfort. Once the city fell, violence did not stop. It expanded. Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Streets filled with bodies. Blood soaked into stone floors of homes and places of worship. Some sources speak in exaggerated numbers, others more cautiously, but all agree that it was a massacre. This moment forces an uncomfortable comparison with the present. Modern warfare, for all its horrors, is often accompanied by language about restraint, rules of engagement, civilian protection, even when these ideals fail. In 1099, there was no such framework. The sack of a city was considered normal, even expected. And yet, what makes Jerusalem different is not just the scale of violence, but the certainty with which it was carried out. Crusaders believed they were not committing atrocities. They believed they were cleansing sacred space. Killing became liturgy. Bloodshed became proof of devotion. The city was holy, therefore anything done to secure it must also be holy. After the killing ended, a strange quiet settled over Jerusalem. Crusaders walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, still stained with blood, and gave thanks. They sang hymns. They wept again, but now in relief rather than anticipation. Many believed their sins were truly gone, washed away not just by suffering, but by victory. And then a realization slowly emerged. There was nothing left to do. The goal that had structured their lives for years had been achieved. Some immediately returned home, broken, aging, carrying memories they could not explain. Others stayed, carving out new Crusader states in hostile land, surrounded by enemies, dependent on constant war for survival. Jerusalem did not bring peace. It brought responsibility, paranoia, and permanent tension. The men who had dreamed of salvation now found themselves governing, taxing, judging, and killing again. Not as pilgrims, but as rulers. The crusade had promised an ending. Instead, it created a beginning, one defined by cycles of violence that would repeat for generations. The city remained sacred. The land remained contested. And the idea that God could be claimed as a weapon had been proven terrifyingly effective. Taking Jerusalem felt like the end of history. Living there quickly proved that it was not. After the prayers, the processions, and the first weeks of stunned silence, the Crusaders were faced with a problem they had never truly prepared for: ordinary life. The holy city was conquered, but it was not empty. It had to be governed, defended, fed, and controlled. Many Crusaders had imagined themselves as temporary instruments of God, not administrators or settlers. Yet suddenly they were expected to rule a land they did not understand, over people who did not welcome them, while surrounded by enemies who very much wanted them gone. Faith had carried them through the journey. Now logistics, discipline, and compromise would decide whether they survived. From this uncertainty emerged new political entities, the most famous being the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a fragile creation, narrow, underpopulated, and permanently on the brink of collapse. Its rulers were not kings by tradition or bloodline, but by circumstance and force. The first of them, Baldwin I of Jerusalem, had not originally set out to rule anything. Like many others, he adapted because he had no real alternative. Going home meant returning as a changed man, often impoverished and psychologically scarred. Staying meant constant danger, but also status, land, and meaning. Many chose to stay. Daily life in the Crusader states was a strange blend of familiarity and alienness. European-style castles rose above Middle Eastern landscapes. Latin Christian laws were imposed over cities that had followed Islamic or Eastern Christian traditions for centuries. Markets sold spices, fruits, and fabrics unknown in the West. Crusaders ate flatbread, dates, figs, and lamb seasoned with flavors that would later transform European cuisine. Over time, some adopted local clothing better suited to the heat, lighter fabrics, looser robes. This adaptation unsettled newly arrived Crusaders from Europe, who sometimes accused long-term settlers of becoming too Eastern, too comfortable, too soft. Identity became unstable. Were they pilgrims, colonists, defenders of Christ, or simply survivors? Beneath the surface, fear dominated everything. The Crusader states were chronically undermanned. Every adult male was, in effect, a soldier on call. Fields were cultivated with one eye always on the horizon. Villages could be raided at any moment. Roads were unsafe beyond the protection of fortifications. There was no clear front line. Danger was everywhere. Modern people often think of war as an interruption of normal life. In the Crusader states, war was the environment. Peace was the exception, not the rule. Children grew up knowing siege protocols as naturally as prayer. Women learned how to manage households that could be destroyed overnight. Religion remained central, but it changed in tone. During the march east, faith had been emotional, desperate, visionary. In the Crusader kingdoms, it became institutional and disciplined. Churches were organized, laws codified, tithes collected. The Holy War became routine administration. This normalization of sacred violence is one of the most unsettling legacies of the Crusades. Killing was no longer a moment of ecstatic purpose. It was a job requirement. Knights defended borders not in expectation of salvation, but to keep land and status. The original spiritual intensity faded, replaced by something colder and more pragmatic. If we compare this to modern life, the contrast is revealing. Today, people often imagine that achieving a great goal, success, freedom, recognition will bring resolution. The Crusaders achieved their ultimate goal and discovered instead maintenance. Meaning had to be sustained daily, not proven once. The miracle had passed. What remained was responsibility. Many struggled with this. Some became brutal out of habit. Others grew cynical. A few attempted genuine coexistence with local populations, trading, negotiating, even forming uneasy truces. These moments of cooperation are often overlooked, but they existed, fragile, temporary, and constantly threatened by new arrivals from Europe who brought fresh zeal and old hatreds. The Crusader states survived not because they were strong, but because their enemies were divided. This balance would not last. Muslim leaders learned, adapted, and unified. And as decades passed, the children of the first Crusaders inherited a land defined entirely by conflict, a homeland built on memory of a journey they themselves had never made. For them, Jerusalem was not a dream. It was a burden. As the Crusader states struggled to survive, a new kind of warrior emerged, one that had never existed before in Christian history. These men were not simply knights, and they were not simply monks. They were both at once. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet trained daily for war. They prayed for hours, then rode out to kill. This fusion of monastery and battlefield gave birth to the military orders, institutions that would shape the Crusades far more deeply than most kings ever did. What began as a practical solution to insecurity would slowly evolve into something resembling a permanent war machine sanctified by religion. The earliest and most famous of these orders was the Knights Templar. Their original purpose was simple: protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. The roads were deadly, and the Crusader states lacked manpower to guard them. A small group of knights offered themselves for this task, living communally, owning nothing, and dedicating their lives to both God and violence. At first, they were poor, obscure, almost invisible, but they had something powerful on their side: papal support. When the Church officially endorsed them, donations flooded in. Land, money, castles, privileges. Within decades, the Templars transformed from a handful of armed monks into an international institution with branches across Europe and the Middle East. Life inside the order was rigid, repetitive, and psychologically intense. A Templar woke before dawn for prayer, ate simple meals in silence, trained relentlessly, and followed strict rules governing everything from speech to posture. Individual identity was erased. Uniforms were plain, personal wealth forbidden, obedience absolute. This structure was not accidental, it was designed to remove hesitation. In battle, a Templar did not fight for personal glory or survival. He fought because obedience demanded it. Retreat without orders was considered sinful. Death was not tragedy. It was fulfillment. For a modern person, this level of institutional control feels extreme, even terrifying. But for men who had lived through the chaos of the early Crusades, it offered clarity, belonging, and relief from moral ambiguity. Someone else decided what was right. Someone else carried responsibility. Alongside the Templars rose another powerful order, the Knights Hospitaller. Cluniac movement, a reformist movement within the Benedictine monastic order that sought to strengthen religious devotion and charity for the poor. Earlier in the 11th century, merchants from Amalfi founded a hospital in Jerusalem dedicated to John the Baptist, where Benedictine monks cared for sick, poor, or injured Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. Blessed Gerard, a lay brother of the Benedictine order, became its head when it was established. After the Christian conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade, the Hospitallers rose in prominence and were recognized as a distinct order by Pope Paschal II in 1113. The Order of St. John was militarized in the 1120s and 1130s, hiring knights that later became Hospitallers. The organization became a military religious order under its own papal charter, charged with the care and defense of the Holy Land, and fought in the Crusades until the Siege of Acre in 1291. Following the reconquest of the Holy Land by Islamic forces, the knights operated from Rhodes, over which they were sovereign, and later from Malta, where they administered a vassal state under the Spanish viceroy of Sicily. The Hospitallers also controlled the North African city of Tripoli for 2 decades in the 16th century, and they were one of the smallest groups to have colonized parts of the Americas, briefly acquiring 4 Caribbean islands in the mid-17th century, which they turned over to France in the 1660s. The Knights became divided during the Protestant Reformation, when rich commanderies of the order in northern Germany and the Netherlands became Protestant and largely separated from the Catholic mainstem, remaining separate to this day. Modern ecumenical relations between the descendant chivalric orders are amicable. The order was suppressed in England, Denmark, and other parts of Northern Europe, and was further damaged by Napoleons. They began as caregivers running hospitals for sick and wounded pilgrims. Over time, however, necessity pulled them into war. Protecting the sick required armed defense. Armed defense required discipline, Discipline led inevitably to militarization. Like the Templars, the Hospitallers combined charity with brutality, tending wounds one day and storming fortifications the next. This duality was not seen as hypocrisy. It was seen as balance. To heal Christians and kill enemies of Christ were considered parts of the same sacred duty. These orders changed the nature of crusading life. Warfare became professionalized. Castles were designed not just as noble residences, but as strategic instruments. Supply lines were organized. Intelligence networks formed. The Holy War was no longer dependent on waves of emotional enthusiasm from Europe. It could now be sustained by institutions that existed year after year, generation after generation. This was a turning point. The Crusades stopped being a series of expeditions and became a system that required constant conflict to justify its own existence. Yet this system came at a psychological cost. Members of the orders lived under relentless pressure. There was no retirement, no family, no personal future. Aging knights who survived battle did not return home. They trained younger recruits and waited for death. Some found peace in this simplicity. Others grew hard, inflexible, incapable of imagining a world without enemies. Violence, repeated daily, ceased to feel exceptional. It became normal, even comforting. Modern people often talk about burnout from careers that consume identity. The military orders were an early, extreme version of that phenomenon, total dedication without exit. From the outside, these orders inspired both admiration and fear. Kings relied on them but resented their independence. Ordinary crusaders respected their discipline but whispered about arrogance and cruelty. Muslim opponents quickly learned that facing an order knight meant facing an enemy who would not flee, negotiate, or surrender easily. This reputation alone altered battlefield dynamics. The orders did not just fight wars, they shaped how wars were fought. By the mid-12th century, the Crusader states were no longer held together by faith alone. They were held together by castles, routines, hierarchies, and men who had turned belief into muscle memory. The original question of the Crusades, how violence could serve God, had been answered institutionally. The answer was efficiency. For decades, the Crusades had been told almost entirely from one direction. As a Christian epic of pilgrimage, suffering, and divine reward. But beyond the castles and banners of the Crusader states existed a much larger world that had not asked for this war, had not understood it at first, and would eventually learn how to answer it. The Muslim Middle East of the 11th and early 12th centuries was not a single unified power. It was politically fragmented, divided by rival dynasties, sectarian tensions, and local ambitions. To many Muslim rulers, the first Crusaders appeared not as an existential threat, but as yet another group of foreign mercenaries, strange, violent, and temporary. This initial underestimation allowed the Crusader states to survive far longer than they otherwise might have. Early Muslim chroniclers often described the Crusaders with a mix of confusion and contempt. They were seen as crude, unhygienic, emotionally excessive warriors who fought fiercely but without sophistication. The Crusaders' religious obsession was noted, but not immediately feared. In Islamic political culture, war was normal, borders shifted often, and religious difference alone did not automatically justify total war. What shocked Muslim observers was not that Christians fought, it was how they fought. Their willingness to die without retreat, their indifference to negotiation, and their massacres of civilian populations violated established norms of warfare. Over time, this behavior reframed the conflict. What had seemed like a regional nuisance began to feel like a civilizational threat. As years passed, memory accumulated. Stories of Jerusalem in 1099 did not disappear. They circulated in sermons, poetry, and court histories. Slowly, a counter-narrative formed, one that mirrored the Crusaders' own sacred logic. If the Franks claimed holy war, then resistance could also be holy. This shift did not happen overnight. It required leadership capable of uniting faith with politics, restraint with determination. That leadership would eventually emerge not from chaos, but from discipline. One of the first major figures to understand this was Nur ad-Din. He was not just a warlord, but a reformer. He emphasized justice, religious legitimacy, and moral conduct, presenting resistance to the Crusaders as a duty rather than an opportunity for personal gain. Under his rule, the idea of jihad evolved from a theological concept into a structured political program aimed specifically at reclaiming lost lands. Importantly, this was not framed as indiscriminate violence. It was framed as order restored. Where the Crusaders ruled through castles and fear, Nur ad-Din sought legitimacy through law and piety. This contrast mattered. It attracted allies, it stabilized territory, and it prepared the ground for someone even more consequential. That person was Saladin. To modern audiences, Saladin often appears as a romanticized figure, noble, chivalrous, merciful. Medieval reality was more complex, but his significance is undeniable. Saladin understood something fundamental that many Crusader leaders never fully grasped. Wars of belief are won not only by force, but by narrative. He carefully cultivated an image of moral authority, presenting himself as a ruler who fought not for personal ambition, but for restoration of sacred balance. His court promoted learning, law, and religious unity. His armies were disciplined, professional, and increasingly unified, the opposite of the fragmented forces that had once faced the First Crusaders. Life under Muslim rule during this period contrasted sharply with Crusader governance. Cities functioned as economic and cultural hubs. Trade routes connected the Mediterranean to Asia. Scholars, jurists, physicians, and poets operated within stable institutions. War existed, but it did not consume the entirety of life. This difference shaped long-term outcomes. Crusader states depended on constant reinforcement and conflict to survive. Muslim polities could afford patience. They could wait, regroup, adapt. Time in this conflict favored stability, and stability was something the Crusader states never truly achieved. From a modern perspective, this phase of the Crusades feels familiar in an unsettling way. We see two systems colliding, one driven by ideological intensity and permanent mobilization, the other by gradual consolidation and legitimacy building. In contemporary terms, it resembles conflicts where an occupying force relies on technological or moral superiority, while local powers rely on endurance, memory, and social cohesion. The Crusades were not just battles over land. They were competitions over which worldview could last longer. By the time Saladin was ready to act decisively, the Crusader states were already under serious internal strain, torn apart by rivalries. By the late 1180s, the Crusader states looked strong on maps but weak in reality. Their castles still dominated hills and roads. Their banners still flew above stone walls. But the internal cohesion that had once held them together was gone. Generations had passed since the First Crusade. Many knights now ruling the Kingdom of Jerusalem had never known the long march, the hunger, or the terror that had forged their grandfathers. For them, the Holy Land was not a miracle achieved through suffering. it was inherited property. Politics became petty. Rival nobles competed for influence. Personal honor replaced collective survival. And most dangerously, the enemy to the east was no longer divided. Saladin moved patiently. He did not rush toward Jerusalem in a blaze of religious fury. Instead, he isolated, weakened, and exhausted the Crusader states, cutting supply lines, provoking small engagements, testing responses. He understood their psychology. He knew that Crusader armies felt compelled to respond aggressively to threats, to prove strength through confrontation. This knowledge allowed him to shape the battlefield before a single decisive blow was struck. The Crusaders, confident in their heavy cavalry and past victories, believed that God would once again reward boldness. They marched not because it was wise, but because retreat felt like moral failure. That march ended at Battle of Hattin. The location itself was a trap, dry, exposed, far from reliable water sources, under relentless summer heat. Saladin's forces harassed constantly, denying rest and water, surrounding rather than engaging. The Crusader army, weighed down by armor, dehydrated, and disorganized, slowly collapsed. Horses died first, then men. Formation broke. Panic spread. The sacred relic of the true cross, carried into battle as a symbol of divine presence, was captured. For many Crusaders, this moment was more devastating than the military defeat itself. The cross was not just wood, it was a guarantee. And now it was gone. The defeat at Hattin was total. Almost the entire fighting force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was destroyed in a single campaign. Knights who had believed themselves invincible were taken prisoner or killed. Leaders were executed or humiliated. When news spread, shock rippled across the Christian world. This was not supposed to happen. The Crusades had been built on the assumption that righteous violence would be rewarded. Hattin shattered that assumption. For the first time on a massive scale, God seemed silent. With the Crusader states defenseless, the road to Jerusalem lay open. Cities surrendered one by one, not out of loyalty to Saladin, but because resistance was hopeless. When Saladin finally reached Jerusalem, the situation was utterly different from 1099. The city was poorly defended, crowded with refugees, and haunted by memory. Everyone remembered the massacre. Everyone feared its repetition. But what followed surprised even contemporaries. Jerusalem surrendered after negotiation. Civilians were ransomed rather than slaughtered. Jews were allowed to return. Churches were protected. Saladin deliberately chose restraint, not out of sentimentality, but strategy. He understood that mercy could be more powerful than revenge. Where the Crusaders had ruled through terror, he ruled through contrast. This moment echoed far beyond the battlefield. In the Christian world, the loss of Jerusalem triggered grief, anger, and deep confusion. Preachers struggled to explain why God had allowed this reversal. Some blamed sin. Others blamed complacency. Others insisted that faith must be renewed through even greater sacrifice. The idea that God might not automatically side with Christian armies was deeply unsettling. It forced a rethinking of the crusade itself, not as a guaranteed path to salvation, but as a gamble, one that could end in failure without meaning. For modern readers, this psychological shift is crucial. Today, people often associate belief systems, religious or ideological, with certainty and reassurance. The aftermath of Hattin shows the opposite. When belief is tied too closely to success, failure becomes existential. The Crusaders did not just lose a city. They lost a framework for understanding the world. The silence of God on the battlefield created a vacuum that could only be filled by escalation. If the first crusade had been born from hope, the next ones would be born from humiliation. The fall of Jerusalem did not end the Crusades. It made them more desperate. Calls went out across Europe once again, but the tone had changed. This was no longer a story of miraculous victory. It was a story of loss that demanded correction. The idea that history itself had gone wrong took hold, and someone somewhere had to fix it. The call that followed the loss of Jerusalem did not summon crowds of peasants or barefoot pilgrims. It summoned kings. The era of ecstatic faith and chaotic marches was over. What came next was colder, heavier, and far more political. The Third Crusade was not driven by visions or mass enthusiasm, but by wounded prestige. Jerusalem had fallen, and with it the credibility of Christian power in the East. For the rulers of Europe, this was no longer only about God. It was about authority, reputation, and the balance of power. The crusade became a stage where monarchs would test themselves against history and against one another. Three great rulers answered the call: the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the French King Philip II of France, and the English King Richard I, later remembered as Richard the Lionheart. Never before had such concentrated royal power been directed toward the Holy Land. This alone tells us something important. The Crusades had evolved. They were no longer movements that overwhelmed rulers from below. They were instruments wielded from the top down. Planning was meticulous. Armies were professional. Supply lines were calculated. Faith was still present, but it no longer replaced strategy, it justified it. The journey east itself revealed the change. When Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river in Anatolia, his massive army disintegrated almost overnight. This was not interpreted as a divine sign in the way earlier disasters had been. It was treated as a logistical catastrophe. Leadership mattered now more than miracles. The surviving forces that reached the Levant were smaller, more disciplined, and far more aware of their limits. When Richard and Philip arrived, they did not march blindly toward Jerusalem. They focused first on reclaiming strategic positions, most importantly the port city of Acre. Control of the coast meant control of reinforcements, trade, and survival. The siege of Acre was brutal, prolonged, and revealing. Unlike earlier sieges, this was a clash of professionals. Engineers built and countered machines. Diplomats negotiated while soldiers died. Disease ravaged both sides, and beneath it all ran a current of rivalry between Christian allies. Richard and Philip distrusted each other deeply. Each victory raised questions of credit. Each failure created suspicion. This internal fracture was perhaps the most important difference between the Third Crusade and the First. Where earlier Crusaders had been bound by shared desperation, these kings were bound only temporarily by shared embarrassment. Cooperation was fragile, and ego constantly threatened to undo it. Richard the Lionheart emerged as the dominant military figure. He was fearless in battle, tactically gifted, and personally charismatic. Yet even his legend exposes how much the Crusades had changed. Richard fought brilliantly, and yet he never retook Jerusalem. He won battles, secured coastlines, negotiated truces, and earned respect even from Saladin. But the city itself remained out of reach. At one point, Richard came close enough to see Jerusalem from a distance. He turned back. The reasons were practical: lack of water, internal dissent, the impossibility of holding the city even if it were taken. This moment would have been unthinkable in 1099. Then, belief demanded action regardless of consequence. Now, reality imposed limits even on kings. This restraint confused contemporaries and later generations alike. How could a crusade end without Jerusalem? The answer is uncomfortable. The objective had become symbolic rather than operational. Jerusalem still mattered spiritually, but controlling it no longer guaranteed dominance. What mattered was leverage. Ports, castles, treaties, influence. Richard eventually negotiated an agreement that allowed Christian pilgrims access to holy sites while leaving Muslim political control intact. It was a compromise, something the first Crusaders would have seen as failure. Yet, in the context of the Third Crusade, it was presented as success. For the modern observer, this phase of the Crusades feels strikingly familiar. Ideological wars often begin with absolute goals and end with negotiated realities. The Third Crusade shows what happens when belief collides repeatedly with complexity. The language remains sacred, but the behavior becomes strategic. Leaders still speak of God, but they act like politicians. The transformation is subtle but decisive. Holy war had not disappeared, it had been absorbed into statecraft. When Richard finally left the Holy Land, he departed not as a conqueror, but as a tactician who had stabilized a situation he could not resolve. The Crusades would continue, but something essential had been lost. The certainty that God would intervene decisively, that victory was proof of righteousness, was gone. What remained was an endless sequence of campaigns, each more entangled with politics than the last, each promising restoration but delivering only delay. After the Third Crusade, the word crusade remained powerful, but its meaning began to blur. What had once been a singular, dangerous journey toward a sacred goal slowly turned into a reusable political tool. Popes continued to call for crusades. Preachers continued to promise spiritual rewards. Crosses were still sewn onto clothing. Yet the emotional core was hollowing out. People noticed the pattern. Enormous sacrifice, limited results, negotiated endings, and no lasting miracle. Faith did not disappear, but credibility weakened. The Fourth Crusade exposed this decay more clearly than anything before it. Originally proclaimed to retake Jerusalem, it never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, through a chain of debts, political manipulation, and ambition, the Crusader army turned on Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. In 1204, Crusaders stormed, looted, and burned it. Churches were stripped, relics stolen, civilians murdered. For the first time, a crusade was openly waged against fellow Christians. Not by accident, not in confusion, but deliberately. This was not holy war in any traditional sense. It was opportunism baptized with religious language. The psychological damage of this event cannot be overstated. For Eastern Christians, it was a betrayal that never healed. For Western observers, it raised a disturbing question. If Crusaders could sack Constantinople, what exactly made a war holy anymore? The answer, increasingly, was authority. If the Pope approved it, it counted. If not, it was heresy or rebellion. The moral compass no longer pointed toward Jerusalem, pointed toward power. From this point onward, crusades multiplied, but not in spirit. They were declared against Muslims in Spain, against pagans in the Baltic, against heretical Christian groups in southern France, and even against political enemies of the papacy. The most infamous of these was the Albigensian Crusade, waged against Christians labeled heretics. Entire towns were destroyed. When asked how to distinguish heretics from the faithful, a papal representative allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether or not the quote is authentic, it captured the mood perfectly. Precision no longer mattered. Victory justified everything. Daily life for participants in these later crusades was far less idealistic than before. Many joined for land, debt relief, or legal immunity. Nobles used crusade vows as political cover. Knights treated them as campaigns like any other, only with better publicity. The promise of salvation still existed, but it competed with very earthly incentives. The crusade had become a system of permission to kill, to seize, to rule, rather than a test of faith. To a modern person, this stage of the Crusades feels uncomfortably recognizable. Big ideas, once born from genuine belief, often survive by becoming flexible. They adapt to serve institutions. They get reused, diluted, and eventually exploited. The later Crusades show how moral language can outlive moral clarity. People continue to speak the words long after they stop feeling their weight. By the 13th century, even enthusiasm faded. Calls for crusades still echoed across Europe, but responses were smaller, less passionate. Jerusalem changed hands again and again, each time with less global shock. The Holy Land was no longer the emotional center of Christendom. New concerns emerged: trade, internal politics, dynastic wars. The world had grown larger. Attention had shifted. Yet the idea of the crusade did not die. It lingered as memory, as myth, as warning. It had proven that belief could move entire civilizations, and that once unleashed, it could not easily be controlled. The Crusades no longer needed Jerusalem to exist. They existed as a concept, ready to be invoked whenever authority needed moral fire. By the late 13th century, the Crusades in the Holy Land no longer felt like a grand historical movement. They felt like maintenance, a constant, exhausting effort to delay something everyone sensed was inevitable. The great visions were gone. The kings had stopped coming. What remained were narrow strips of coastline, over-fortified cities, and aging institutions trying to justify their continued existence. The Crusader states had shrunk to little more than outposts clinging to the Mediterranean, sustained by sea routes and memories rather than momentum. The Holy Land was no longer a destination of faith. It was a liability. Life in the final Crusader strongholds was tense and claustrophobic. Cities like Acre were overcrowded with refugees, soldiers, merchants, and clergy. Every group had different priorities, and none fully trusted the others. Italian trading republics fought each other in the streets over commercial privileges. Military orders argued over authority. Civilian populations lived under constant threat, aware that the walls protecting them also trapped them. War was no longer episodic, it was atmospheric. People married knowing their homes might not exist in a year. Children grew up surrounded by weapons, hearing sermons that promised salvation while witnessing slow decline. The defenders of these cities were experienced but tired. Unlike the first Crusaders, they did not believe they were chosen instruments of God. They believed they were holding a line because someone had to. The rhetoric of holy war still existed, but it felt routine, almost bureaucratic. Prayers were said because they were expected, not because miracles were anticipated. Even the military orders, once symbols of absolute commitment, were now deeply entangled in politics, finances, and internal disputes. Their discipline remained, but the clarity of purpose that had once defined them was gone. Meanwhile, the Muslim world had changed in the opposite direction. The trauma of the early Crusades had been absorbed, processed, and integrated into a broader historical narrative. New powers emerged, most notably the Mamluks, whose rulers viewed the remaining Crusader enclaves not as sacred enemies, but as strategic irritants. They were methodical, patient, unemotional. The elimination of Crusader presence became a matter of state security, not spiritual drama. This difference in mindset mattered. One side was defending a myth, the other was executing a plan. When the final assault came, it was overwhelming but not surprising. In 1291, Acre was besieged by a massive Mamluk army. The defenders fought fiercely, knowing that retreat was impossible. Street by street, the city collapsed. There were acts of bravery, moments of horror, and scenes of desperate evacuation as ships tried to rescue as many as possible before the harbor fell. But there was no sense of cosmic significance, no expectation that history would turn. This was not Jerusalem in 1099. It was an ending shaped by exhaustion rather than revelation. When Acre fell, the Crusades in the Holy Land effectively ended. Not with a decisive philosophical reckoning, but with silence. No great council announced the conclusion. No final sermon declared failure. Europe simply moved on. Trade continued. Politics shifted. New wars captured attention. The Holy Land became a place of memory rather than ambition. Crusades would still be preached elsewhere, against other enemies, but the original project, holding Jerusalem through holy war, was over. For modern people, this kind of ending feels familiar. We are used to narratives that fade rather than conclude, movements that dissolve without admitting defeat. The end of the Crusades in the East was not marked by realization, but by distraction. The idea had lost its urgency, and without urgency, even the most powerful beliefs slowly decay. Yet the consequences did not disappear. The Crusades left scars in relationships between religions, in collective memory, in the language of war and righteousness. They reshaped trade, knowledge exchange, and political imagination. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated a dangerous truth. Once violence is framed as sacred, it can persist long after its original purpose has vanished. When the last ships left the Levant and the final Crusader banners vanished from the eastern coast, Europe did not feel victorious, defeated, or even particularly reflective. Instead, it felt changed, though few people could clearly explain how. The Crusades had failed in their original promise. Jerusalem was not held, salvation was not guaranteed, and God had not reshaped history in a lasting way. Yet the centuries of movement, violence, and contact had left deep marks. Crusaders returned not only with scars and stories, but with habits, expectations, and ideas that quietly transformed European life long after the fighting ended. One of the most immediate changes was material. Crusaders had encountered a world far more urbanized, literate, and commercially connected than much of medieval Europe. They returned with tastes for spices, sugar, citrus fruits, rice, silks, and cotton luxuries that slowly became necessities for the elite. Trade routes expanded to meet this demand, strengthening Mediterranean commerce and empowering cities like Venice and Genoa. What had begun as holy war accelerated the shift from a rural, feudal economy toward a more commercial, money-based one. In a sense, the Crusades taught Europe to want more goods, more comfort, more connection to the wider world. Knowledge moved as well, though more subtly. Through contact with the Islamic world, Europeans encountered advanced medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars. Texts by Aristotle, long lost in the West, re-entered European thought through Arabic translations. Medical practices, hospital organization, and pharmacology improved. This exchange was not always direct or friendly, but it was unavoidable. Even enemies learn from each other. The Crusades helped break Europe's intellectual isolation, preparing the ground for later developments that would culminate in universities, scholasticism, and eventually the Renaissance. Psychologically, the impact was even deeper. The Crusades expanded Europe's sense of scale. Before them, the world felt local, almost claustrophobic. After them, Europe knew it was part of something vast and complex. People became aware of other civilizations that were not simply barbaric or demonic, but structured, powerful, and sophisticated. This realization was uncomfortable. It challenged the assumption of inherent Christian superiority. At the same time, it sharpened identity. Europeans increasingly defined themselves against others, Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, in clearer, harder terms. The Crusades did not invent religious hostility, but they intensified and organized it. Violence itself changed meaning. The idea that war could be morally elevated, framed as redemptive, left a lasting imprint. Even when later conflicts were not religious, they borrowed crusading language, righteousness, destiny, sacrifice. This pattern repeats throughout history. Once a society learns how to sanctify violence, it rarely forgets the technique. Modern people often believe they are immune to this mindset, yet the impulse to describe wars as necessary, cleansing, or inevitable shows how persistent the legacy is. There was also disappointment, quiet, unresolved disappointment. Many Crusaders returned poorer than when they left. Families were broken. Lands were lost. The promised spiritual certainty never fully arrived. This disillusionment did not lead to mass rejection of religion, but it did encourage distance. Faith became more personal, less absolute. The unquestioned confidence of the early crusading era faded. In its place grew a more complex, sometimes anxious religiosity, one that wrestled with doubt, failure, and unanswered prayer. The Crusades had forced Christianity to confront the possibility that God's will was not always legible through success. From a modern perspective, this feels strikingly familiar. We often embark on large projects, ideological, political, even personal, expecting transformation, only to discover unintended consequences instead. The Crusades remind us that history rarely delivers what it promises. Instead, it leaves residues, habits of thought, structures of power, unspoken assumptions. Europe did not become holier because of the Crusades. It became more connected, more ambitious, more conflicted. By the time the Crusades faded into memory, they had already accomplished something far more lasting than conquest. They had altered Europe's relationship with the world and with itself. The Holy Land was lost, but the mental boundaries of the West had expanded permanently. When the Crusades ended as historical events, they began a second life as stories. And stories, unlike armies, do not obey facts. They obey needs. Each generation that followed reshaped the Crusades to fit its own fears, hopes, and self-image. What actually happened in the Levant, the hunger, the massacres, the compromises, the failures, slowly faded behind layers of interpretation. Memory did not preserve the Crusades. It reconstructed them. In medieval Europe, the first narratives were written by clerics and nobles who had a vested interest in meaning. Chronicles emphasized divine purpose, heroic suffering, and moral clarity. Failures were reframed as tests. Atrocities were minimized, justified, or omitted entirely. Jerusalem in 1099 became a moment of triumph rather than terror. The long decline that followed was compressed or ignored. History, in these accounts, was not a record of events but a sermon stretched across centuries. This was not deception in the modern sense, it was expectation. Medieval readers did not want neutral analysis. They wanted reassurance that God still governed the world. As time passed and Europe changed, the Crusades were repurposed again. During the age of monarchies and emerging nation-states, they became stories of chivalry. Knights were romanticized as noble warriors bound by honor, courage, and loyalty. Violence was aestheticized. Armor shone. Battles became duels. The suffering of civilians vanished almost entirely. This version of the Crusades had little to do with faith and much to do with identity. It allowed European elites to imagine a glorious ancestral past, one that justified hierarchy, masculinity, and rule. The Crusades became less about God and more about who deserved power. Later still, during the Enlightenment, the tone flipped. Thinkers hostile to organized religion portrayed the Crusades as evidence of superstition, fanaticism, and moral failure. Crusaders were no longer heroes but fools, manipulated by priests, driven by ignorance, incapable of reason. This critique served a new purpose. By condemning the Crusades, Enlightenment writers could distance themselves from the medieval past and argue for rationality, secular governance, and progress. Once again, the Crusades were not being studied, they were being used. In the modern era, memory fractured further. In Western popular culture, the Crusades oscillated between romantic adventure and moral embarrassment. Films, novels, and games often stripped them of religious context entirely, turning them into exotic backdrops for personal drama. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Crusades became symbols of foreign invasion, betrayal, and humiliation. Early examples of Western aggression cloaked in moral language. These memories were not symmetrical. They did not need to be. Memory is shaped by injury more than by curiosity. What makes this especially important is that the Crusades never fully retreated into the past. They remained emotionally available. Political leaders, extremists, and ideologues have repeatedly revived crusading language to legitimize modern conflicts. The word crusade itself still carries power, enough that its careless use can inflame tensions centuries later. This persistence tells us something uncomfortable. The Crusades endure not because of what they achieved, but because they offer a ready-made narrative of righteous struggle. A story where complexity is optional and enemies are eternal. For modern people, this raises a difficult question. When we look back at the Crusades, are we trying to understand them, or are we searching for confirmation of what we already believe about religion, violence, or the past? The Crusades act like a mirror. Those who fear faith see fanaticism. Those who admire conviction see courage. Those who distrust power see manipulation. Those who value order see purpose. History does not resolve these disagreements. It exposes them. What is perhaps most striking is how rarely the everyday experience of the Crusades survives in memory. The boredom, the hunger, the administrative grind, the fear of disease, the slow erosion of certainty. These things do not translate well into legend. Yet they define the Crusades far more than any single battle. The people who lived through them did not feel like characters in a myth. They felt tired, confused, trapped by choices they could not undo. In that sense, they are closer to us than the stories suggest. By the time the Crusades had been fully absorbed into cultural memory, they no longer belonged to the medieval world alone. They became raw material, shaped and reshaped by whoever needed them. And that is why they remain so difficult to discuss calmly today. We are not just arguing about the past. We are arguing about which story of the past we are allowed to inherit. It is tempting to treat the Crusades as an alien phenomenon, a product of medieval ignorance, religious obsession, and a world that no longer exists. This distance is comforting. It allows modern people to believe that we have outgrown such thinking, that we are protected by reason, education, and secular institutions. And yet, when we look closely at how the Crusades functioned, the uncomfortable truth emerges. The logic behind them did not vanish. It adapted. It learned new language, put on modern clothing. At their core, the Crusades were not just wars. They were wars with meaning guaranteed in advance. The outcome did not determine whether the cause was right. The cause determined how the outcome would be interpreted. Victory meant divine approval. Defeat meant a test, a betrayal, or insufficient commitment. This closed system is crucial. Once a conflict is framed this way, it becomes immune to evidence. Suffering no longer questions the goal, it reinforces it. Doubt becomes moral weakness. Withdrawal becomes treason to something larger than life itself. Modern ideologies often operate in the same structure, even when they reject religion outright. Political movements, national projects, and revolutionary causes regularly describe themselves as inevitable, necessary, or morally absolute. They speak of history, destiny, justice, or security in ways that leave no room for ambiguity. Like the Crusades, these frameworks promise meaning in exchange for obedience. They offer a story in which sacrifice is never wasted, because it serves something transcendent. The language has changed, but the emotional mechanics are strikingly familiar. Another parallel lies in how enemies are defined. During the Crusades, opponents were rarely treated as individuals. They were categories: infidels, heretics, threats to sacred order. Once a group is framed this way, empathy becomes irrelevant. Violence no longer needs to be justified case by case. It is justified in advance. Modern conflicts often rely on the same abstraction. Enemies are labeled as terrorists, traitors, extremists, or dangers to civilization itself. These labels are not always false, but they are powerful precisely because they reduce complexity. They make killing feel clean. The Crusades also reveal how easily institutions adapt to sacred conflict. What began as spontaneous religious enthusiasm hardened into bureaucratic systems. Taxes, orders, laws, propaganda. Once this happened, the war no longer needed belief to survive. It needed only momentum. Modern states and organizations function similarly. Once a system is built around conflict, peace becomes destabilizing. Jobs, identities, hierarchies, and legitimacy depend on continuation. The original goal fades, but the structure remains. The Crusades did not last for centuries because people believed intensely for centuries. They lasted because belief became infrastructure. Perhaps the most unsettling comparison lies in the psychology of participants. Medieval crusaders were not monsters. They were ordinary people living inside an extraordinary narrative. They feared insignificance. They feared damnation. They feared that their suffering meant nothing. The crusade gave them certainty: your pain matters. Modern people, despite vastly different conditions, often carry the same fear: that effort, loss, and sacrifice are meaningless. When an ideology promises significance, it becomes emotionally irresistible. The Crusades remind us that the desire for meaning can be more dangerous than hatred. This does not mean that modern conflicts are simply crusades in disguise. History never repeats that cleanly. But it does mean that the human patterns involved: moral absolutism, sacred language, identity fused with violence, are not medieval relics. They are recurring possibilities. The Middle Ages did not invent them. They revealed them at scale. For modern readers, the value of studying the Crusades is not moral superiority. It is recognition. Recognition that intelligence does not prevent fanaticism. That education does not automatically dissolve certainty. That progress does not erase the human hunger for purpose. The Crusades were not an accident of ignorance. They were a consequence of belief meeting fear and being given permission to act. As we approach the end of the story, one question remains unresolved. What should we do with this knowledge? Remembering the Crusades does not obligate us to condemn or defend them. It obligates us to notice when similar structures appear in our own time, especially when they promise clarity, righteousness, and redemption through conflict. The medieval world believed it was fighting for God. The modern world believes it is fighting for history, freedom, or survival. The names differ. The certainty feels the same. When the Crusades finally slip out of focus, when the battles, names, dates, and slogans recede, what remains is not a verdict, but a landscape. A human landscape shaped by belief, fear, endurance, and unintended consequence. The Crusades do not end with a lesson neatly underlined. They end the way most large human projects end. Unevenly, quietly, leaving traces that outlive the intentions that created them. In purely practical terms, the Crusades failed. Jerusalem was not permanently secured. The Holy Land was not transformed into a Christian world. The promise that sacrifice would guarantee salvation proved unreliable. Entire generations gave their lives to an objective that dissolved the moment sustained pressure was applied. Yet to call the Crusades meaningless would be inaccurate. They mattered, just not in the way their participants expected. They reshaped trade, knowledge, institutions, and identities. They expanded Europe's horizon while narrowing its moral confidence. They connected worlds even as they deepened divisions. What is most striking in retrospect is how ordinary the people involved were. The Crusaders were not symbols when they lived. They were tired men waking up in camps, worrying about food, illness, and whether they would see another morning. They were parents who left children behind, younger sons with no inheritance, widows seeking protection, priests trying to believe their own words. The scale of the Crusades came not from exceptional individuals, but from the alignment of ordinary human needs with an extraordinary narrative. That alignment is rare and dangerous. For the modern person, this is perhaps the most important takeaway. The Crusades were not driven by hatred alone. They were driven by meaning, by the promise that suffering could be organized, justified, and transformed into something eternal. This is why they lasted so long, even when evidence contradicted belief. The fear that life might be pointless is more powerful than the fear of death. The Crusades offered an answer to that fear and demanded everything in return. There is also a quieter lesson, one that emerges only at the end. The Crusades show that history does not punish certainty immediately. It often rewards it first. Early victories reinforced belief. Institutions grew. Authority hardened. Only later did consequences accumulate. Fragmentation, cynicism, exhaustion. By the time failure became undeniable, the people who had made the original decisions were long gone. Responsibility dissolved across generations. This delay makes dangerous ideas harder to resist. They feel validated long before they are disproven. And yet, the story is not only one of destruction. Along the edges of the Crusades, people adapted. They learned languages. They traded. They negotiated. They borrowed ideas. Even in the midst of ideological war, human curiosity persisted. The same conflict that produced massacres also produced hospitals, maps, translations, and unexpected forms of coexistence. This does not redeem the violence, but it reminds us that human behavior is rarely pure in any direction. Light and shadow grow from the same soil. If we compare the Crusades to modern life, the resemblance is not in swords or armor, but in structure. We still build narratives that promise absolute meaning. We still divide the world into moral camps. We still struggle to admit that deeply held beliefs can produce harm without being consciously evil. The Crusades endure as a warning not because they were uniquely cruel, but because they were convincing. In the end, the Crusades do not ask us to judge the past. They ask us to be cautious with the future, to be wary when suffering is described as necessary, when doubt is treated as betrayal, when goals are framed as sacred and therefore immune to revision. History rarely repeats events, but it repeats patterns. The medieval world believed it had found God's will written into geography. The modern world believes it can find destiny written into systems, ideologies, or progress. Both are powerful ideas. Both demand humility. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion the Crusades leave behind. Not that belief is dangerous, but that belief without limits always is.